Alright, so in the chapter 3 we are going to look at MongoDB and Mongoose. So before moving into those database stuff, I think it's better to have understanding about the backend architecture that we are going to follow. So it is basically layered architecture. So layered architecture is a software design pattern, and it organizes different components of a software system into distinct layers. So once this layers has been clearly defined, they will be having a specific purpose, and each layer can communicate with the layer above or below it via well-defined interfaces. So if you look into a diagram, so layered architecture is something like this. So in this diagram you can see there are three main layers. First one is presentation layer, and second one is business logic layer, and third one is data access layer. So each layer is dedicated for a specific purpose. So you can see there are two arrows that is going up and down, which means each layer can communicate the layer above or below it, right? I mean, even the diagram shows like this, it can't jump directly back to this data access layer from presentation layer. It has to go through business logic layer, and the business logic layer will do the corresponding processing stuff. So if any data is going to persist, then it will go to the data access layer, or if it is just needed some sort of a message, then it will go to the presentation layer back again, right? So that is the way how this layered architecture works. So each layer has a specific responsibility, specific task to do. Then it will be very easy to understand for the developers as well, or from the development perspective as well. So main advantages of layered architecture is it helps to separate concerns and promote modularity and make it easy to understand, maintain, and extend the software. Which means if we are going to add more and more business logic, then all we have to do is change this layer only, right? Otherwise, if all the things are cluttered together, then what happens is the modifiability will be drops, which means there will be a very limited amount of availability to do the modifications. But if you are following the backend architecture, what happens is that since all the concerns are separated for distinct layers, we can easily modify the corresponding layer, right? And the scaling can be done very easily, because let's say if we are going to plug more and more components to these layers, all we have to do is clearly define the corresponding interfaces, right? So in this course, actually what we are going to focus is this Express and MongoDB stuff. We are not going to focus on this presentation layer. So presentation layer is basically how the data is presented back to the user, or how the data can be gathered out from the user. So it will be some sort of a UI where you can develop using React or Angular or whatever UI framework that you want. So it's basically about a very simplified user-friendly interface, right? So once the data is gathered, it will be redirected to the business logic layer. So business logic layer is the one that done all the processing stuff through your data. So once all the data has been processed, they will be redirected to the data access layer. So data access layer is a database. So from this tutorial we are using this MongoDB as our database. So the data will be persist to MongoDB. Then MongoDB will basically send an acknowledgement back to the business logic layer. So the relevant function reside in this layer knows then successfully data is persist or not. So if it is persist correctly, then the response will be sent back to the presentation layer, and if it is failed somehow, that error or exception will be redirected to the presentation layer as well, right? So all the hard logics will be rely on this layer. So that is the layer that we are going to focus in more in this chapter, plus this data access layer, right? So how this interoperability or how this communication happen between these two layers. Right. So basically MongoDB is a very popular and open source NoSQL database. It is NoSQL, which means there is no relationship between the data that you are going to store. We can make the relationships in NoSQL as well, but it will be very complicated, and it basically don't satisfy the business process of this of using this database, right? Because if you need relational mappings, then we have to use relational databases such as MySQL or PostgreSQL or something like that. But in NoSQL, it is meant to be have sort of separated data resources. So therefore, for such cases, we can use these NoSQL database. And it is document oriented model, which means there will be JSON objects, which is known document, and this document can be bundled up together to a collection. Then collection can be stored as sort of a table in our MongoDB, right? It's not a table, but it's a collection of document, right? Which is stores these sort of JSON payloads, and this allows flexibility and scalability, which means since we don't have strong relationships in between our data modules, what we can do is basically we can separate or we can easily scale our database components, right? So even in geographically we can do this scaling, right? So MongoDB support geographical scaling as well. But yeah, in this module basically we are going to focus on the basic functionalities of MongoDB, so that will be enough to achieve our tasks. And so Mongoose is basically about it's a library, right? It's sort of a intermediate layer that we going to use when you are dealing with when you are dealing with MongoDB by using Express. So Mongoose is a JavaScript library, and it provides this schema-based solution for modeling and interacting with our database module, which means MongoDB. So it's sit on top of MongoDB driver, and it provides more powerful and flexible way to interact with database. So this is the architecture, which means our Express app is a Node application that relies on here. Then we need to do object mapping to our database, which is MongoDB. So in such cases we need to make a connection between these two separate components. Therefore we have to use MongoDB driver. But if you are directly using MongoDB driver, what happens is that we need to access all the distinct functions, or we need to have understanding about all the different functions that relies on MongoDB. But what we can do is simply we can plug the Mongoose on top of this MongoDB driver. Then MongoDB handle all of those necessary functionalities internally and provide very simplified interfaces for us. So when we are developing our Express application, all we have to call is that those defined functions by Mongoose library. Then Mongoose will handle all the necessary stuff internally, and it will process the data and it will pass it back to the MongoDB driver. Then MongoDB driver basically persists the data on MongoDB, right? So that is the entire workflow, and in next tutorial let's see how this stuff can be done in a practical sense. Right. So thank you.